Welcome to another edition of the Hawk Off the Press podcast. I'm your host, Gazette Hawkeyes reporter, John Steppe. I'm excited to welcome David Eichel from 24/7 onto the podcast. David, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me. It's good to be talking to you. I'm sure we can somehow muster up a couple of things to talk about after the last couple, especially yesterday, but we'll power through it.
Wait, you're telling me there's something interesting, like a press conference or something that happened this week, and it might have involved an offensive coordinator who's certainly not very popular around here?
It's a hot button topic, to say the least. It's a crazy scenario. And again, I know you and I talked off camera a little bit, and I'll bring it up. Nothing that was said yesterday surprised me. I'm sure nothing surprised you.
No.
Yesterday, it didn't matter what was said. There was no way to cool down the temperature of the fan base. Even if they had come out and said changes were coming, people would have said, well, why didn't it happen earlier? You could have recruited some more guys out of the point, and maybe rightfully so at that point. Yesterday was all about how little of gas can they throw on the fire. Instead of droplets, it was the entire container.
Yeah. They doubled down basically on Brian. And, the question comes up how many times about, okay, what does Brian do well? And I think one of the more interesting responses was the one of kind of lumping him together with Phil Parker. And you look at the results, Phil Parker has delivered results. Brian Ferentz really hasn't.
Yeah, I think that's where the biggest miss was yesterday. I think not lumping him and LeVar and Phil together. And by the way, he acted like the way the phrasing sounded. I know he didn't mean this, so I want to make sure that's clear. The way it was phrased was Brian and Phil were here and LeVar was slightly below them. I don't know if that's the way you interpreted it as well.
And it seemed like he was almost trying to, he almost realized what he said and then said, and Phil has been, learning too, or whatever the line was there, where, trying to balance that out after he said that. Yeah, I think that was
a miss.
Yeah, I think that aggravated the fan base a little more.
I also think, though, like you said, the biggest miss was there were 2 or 3 opportunities where he was directly asked, whether it be, I think Scott Dochterman asked one, I think you asked one, I think I asked one. Scott may have said 2, honestly, looking back on it. I have to reread it. What does Brian do well? How does he break down the game film? What are some positive qualities? And he wasn't trying to throw, sugar on crap, right? It wasn't. he just wanted to balance, like, okay, what are you guys seeing that we aren't seeing or the fans aren't seeing? And he just deflected. He dodged the bullets like the Matrix. I mean, he had opportunities just to say some positive qualities, and they didn't do it. And look, the positive qualities might not have calmed the fan base, but at least there's some rationale to what you are thinking and what the thought process is. And again, anybody that expected Kirk to come out and say, yeah, we're making changes to our staff on the late signing day, that was never going to happen.
When you look at the timing of when staff changes happen, well, I should say when staff changes happen from a parting ways with a coach situation rather than the coach gets hired somewhere situation, it probably would have already happened. And I think I've said for a while, whether it's on podcasts, whether it's on radio interviews, that I don't think it's realistic to expect Kirk Ferentz to fire Brian Ferentz. And while Gary Barta is technically the supervisor for Brian Ferentz, really it's Kirk who has kind of the cards in his hands. So I think that was a thing where I think a lot of people were hoping, just because the alternative just doesn't feel great for a lot of fans. But I think this is maybe a little bit of a reality check that, the status quo is continuing.
No, and I think that's true. And here's the other thing that I would say. The only thing that yesterday confirmed is that Kirk is not firing Brian. There is still a chance Brian leaves on his own accord. Mm-hmm. I mean, there's a reason why, in my opinion, he chose to use the words anticipate. And it was, if Brian doesn't leave for an NFL gig, there's some safety net there. And while you mentioned Gary Barta, and I understand why people want to say this is a failure on Gary too. And to some degree, I think you have to have some sort of accountability there. Let's be realistic. If Gary fired Brian, what would the fallback consequences be due to that? As far as, now, this is my speculation. This is not something I'm hearing, so I want to make sure that's clear. How would that impact Kirk's long-term future at Iowa? If the university went over his head, because it would, he'd have to go over Kirk's head because Kirk wants to keep him.
Yeah.
And how would that affect Kirk's timeline as far as when he retires? Because he's not leaving Iowa, obviously. But I really think that that's a realistic thing that Gary's probably had to wrestle with. And, you know, the interesting thing about Iowa is, and obviously I'm a Nebraska grad, people know that, but the one thing that people can say about Nebraska, their boosters are so involved into every single decision that's being made. Iowa boosters really aren't as like hands-on as other like even Auburn, like Auburn boosters is very, very well known how insane they are as far as how hands-on they are. So again, like what would the consequences be if Gary had gone over Kirk's head? And I think that's something people need to really think about.
Because you look at Kirk Ferentz has a lot of job security with the buyout number. The easy way of calculating it is however many months, or in this case, several years. Tack on, you know, $500,000 for every month or $6 million for every year. And it goes through the 2029 season. So somebody that's a math major, I was not a math major, someone that's a math major
far from me
can do the math right now as we're talking about what exactly that number would be right now, but it'd be probably around 40 million or so. That you don't have that level of job security for Gary Barta too. So it's a difficult position that Barta is in. Now, that's not excusing anything that he is or isn't doing, but
agreed.
I think it's an important thing to keep in mind where I think people are used to, okay, if you have a CEO and then you have like a, you know, senior vice president or something. Well, of course the CEO would have more control than a senior vice president.
Yeah.
But the nature of how college athletic departments work, it's not quite that clear as it would seem with the hierarchy.
And this is the thing too, and this is where I understand. And Kirk had some points yesterday, which I know people are so frustrated by the offense, but it is important to keep a couple things in mind. Iowa's injuries sucked last year. And I was impressed that Kirk said they didn't have the personnel because there's not, and that I believe that is true. Because I mean, you didn't have receivers that could get open. I do think the passing route and the schemes are bad right now. I think those need to change. The offensive line needs to jump forward, and they address that by getting 2 players in the portal. And a question I have posed, I'm getting to a point, I promise. The question I have posed is, would you rather have a freshman Caden Proctor for a 1 year? This is what we're talking about just next year. Would you rather have a freshman Caden Proctor at right tackle, or would you rather have Dijon Parker and Rusty Feth as a 1 year go for the title? I think you take Dijon Parker and Rusty Feth, just given the lack of depth that Iowa's offensive line had last year. And the reality is it did start up front. They couldn't block the running. They'd crowd the box. Caleb Johnson's amazing. They still had the numbers he did. And I thought he could have been used a little bit more. But Iowa's receivers starting way back to spring were not healthy. They had 4 receivers sometimes. Brody Brecht missed a lot of his ample practice time when he could get it because he was hurt. Keegan Johnson obviously didn't really play this year. Arlen Bruce is the only scholarship wide receiver. So there were contributing factors why Iowa was bad offensively. But the flip side of it, and this is where I tried to pose it to Kirk yesterday, it's up to the offensive coordinator and the staff to put together the personnel and develop that depth. Like, obviously, there were a lot of misses on the trail on the offensive line, but I also think there were some certain circumstances that didn't help in their favor. I mean, Ezra Miller, medically retired. David Davidkoff, who was, I think, the number 2 tackle, but I think during fall camp or spring practice, he just didn't end up
and
playing.
One of those 2 deeps, they kind of become a blur.
They didn't have, no, I'm with you, but like they didn't have the pieces there, but that would stand up in most cases But let's not act like Iowa football's been an offensive juggernaut under Brian. They've had some great performances, and Gary mentioned it yesterday. Like, look at the 4 years before that. John, I got the numbers in front of me. Let me scroll down real quick. And I'm not talking about scoring offense. That's a different story.
Yeah.
But total yards. In his first year, they were 117th. 2018, they were 92nd. In 2019, they were 99th. And during the 8-game COVID season, they were 88th. And how many of those points, if they want to go by points, how many of those points were due to field goals and defensive touchdowns?
It
ain't the offense winning games.
Yeah. And if you do look at points, because that's the metric that Kirk kept on going to, and you take out the COVID year, because I think there's a huge asterisk when we're talking about the COVID year. Indiana at one point was in the AP top 10, if I'm remembering correctly. You had North Carolina going to the Orange Bowl. You had some abnormalities, to say the least, in that 2020 season. And if you take that out, look at where the 2019 points per game to the 2018 to the 2019 to the 2021 to the 2022. And you see a consistent decrease there in points per game. So even when you're looking at the metrics that we kept on hearing about, as they kind of try to frame it more about points per game, and points per game does it paints a better picture than yards per game.
It does.
But as you mentioned, okay, you've got defensive touchdowns, you've got field goals, you've got things that don't show up necessarily in the stat book as easily. Iowa's secondary has gotten a lot of interceptions in recent seasons. Okay, if you get an interception and the offense has a shorter field, okay, that changes things. You look back at like the 2021 Maryland game. I think that was a great example of where, okay, all those interceptions weren't pick sixes, but when you have those shorter fields, you don't need to do as much offensively to get points. But
you have to be opportunistic. But Iowa can't throw the ball in the red zone. Mm-hmm. And that's been a huge thing as well. I mean, the points per game, I'm happy you brought that up. But let's keep, if they want to go by points per game, Cooper DeJean tied for the team leading touchdown receptions this year.
Well, Luke Lachey got his fourth one. So
he did get his fourth. Okay.
Yes. So
he had the most among wide receivers.
Put that out, and then I was like, wait a second. No. So
Luke did end up scoring that. Yeah, you're right. That. Yeah.
But DeJean, I believe, had
more than a wide receiver.
Yeah.
Every wide receiver.
I believe every wide receiver combined, even, because I think it was 2 and 1. I think, but I could be wrong on that. Don't quote me on that.
But here's the other thing that Sean and I were talking about on our podcast as well, and I want to bring this up. Why is Kirk speak more in broad generalizations when it comes to the offense, and why does he nitpick defense and special teams? Because it really feels like he nitpicks defense and special teams, like he takes them for granted. Now, he's earned that right because they do show up on a consistent basis. You still have to give him credit for that. But the thing that stood out to me yesterday, as well as Kirk said, it's all about winning. And I think everybody sees it, but this is where this may be one of Kirk's blind spots. He's winning in spite of the offense. If Iowa is a top 60 offense next season, or 65, which sounds insane, that's nothing, right?
Mm-hmm.
John, they're arguably the best team in the Big Ten next year if the defense and special teams remain at the same level. Like, that's how close they are to breaking through. And I think that's why it's a boiling point for the fan base, is they see so much opportunity there. And especially if you're talking about Iowa winning the Big Ten championship, next season's the best chance they're going to have for a long time in divisions right now. And with all the turnover in the West, like, I don't know if you share this opinion. Iowa, there should be no reason why Iowa is not back in Indianapolis playing for the Big Ten title next year.
I think if you don't go to Indianapolis, it's a disappointment next year, because as you mentioned, with the coaching changes, you have Purdue going through a coaching transition. You've got Wisconsin going through a coaching transition. You've got Nebraska going through a coaching transition. Long term, I think, especially with Wisconsin and Nebraska, those are good hires. And we'll see what that turns out to be.
I agree.
We've said that before about especially Nebraska coaches. This looks like a good hire. And then maybe not. But
I was very skeptical of Frost really quickly because I was at his introductory press conference because I covered the team. And right when he said like the Big Ten's changing for us, I'm like, bro, you're cooked. Like you can't come in. And I think the AD at the time said like we have Urban Meyers. I think Urban Meyer, we have like Jim Harbaugh and Urban Meyer running scare. And I'm like, dude. The only thing they were running it up is running up the point total against your team.
Pretty much. Like, so
anyway.
This is your opportunity. Like, where you have the divisions in place, so you don't have a situation where, like, well, you do have the situation where you don't have to be ahead of both Ohio State and Michigan, or you don't have to be ahead of either of them. So that makes it where you have an easier position there. You have USC and UCLA join the conference too in the near future, and
USC is looking well, it'll be interesting. They don't play defense yet.
Yeah, that'll be an interesting culture adjustment from Pac-12 culture to Big Ten culture.
Let me see USC come to the Kinnick Stadium, run 3 tight end sets in the 8-degree weathers in a snowy November. That's all I want to see. That'll be great. Yes.
Although I wouldn't mind going out to LA in November.
Wouldn't complain. Would not complain.
Yeah, would not mind that. But anyway,
find a couple things to do.
The opportunity.
Yeah, so, no doubt.
Like, you gotta take advantage, and you have the talent with Cade McNamara coming in at quarterback, with Eric All coming in at tight end. Of course, you lose Sam Laporta. That's a major loss. But when you add Eric Hall and you have Luke Lachey, who had a tremendous year, you have, I think you can go with the personnel wasn't there in terms of 2022. And of course, injuries happen everywhere. So that's the one kind of caveat I'll put with the injuries thing is everyone has to deal with them. It's not like it's a unique thing to Iowa. But I don't think you can say the talent, at least from what we see right now in February, I don't think you can say, okay, the talent isn't there in 2023.
No, I'm with you. And look, Caleb Johnson should run for 1,250 yards next season. He should average over 100 yards a game next season. He has that capability. We've seen how explosive he is. He should be the workhorse. And another guy I'll say, don't sleep on Jazian Patterson.
Oh, yeah.
Look, LaShawn Williams is number 2 right now. I expect a very legitimate competition between the two of them for that number 2 spot. Like, whenever we've asked about Caleb this past season, it's always stood out to me that Kirk brought up Jazian every single time he brought up Caleb and said he's right behind him. He's right behind him. We saw a couple nice flashes in the bowl game about what he can do. So I'm very curious, where he can kind of sit up there. I think Seth Anderson is going to be a very nice addition in the wide receiver room. I think Luke Lachey and Eric all have the potential to be the best tight end duo in the country. I don't want to put like Noah Fant, TJ Hawkinson as far as numbers wise goes.
Yeah.
But they're both they're both very capable of putting up like 400, 500, 600 yards. Like, they have that sort of capability. They have a quarterback that can get them the ball. And I think the thing that's going to separate McNamara more than Petras, with all due respect to Petras, I think he had a lot to deal with, like, as far as a line, lack of weapons, took a lot of hits, etc. Cade McNamara's pocket presence and the way he maneuvers the pocket is all Iowa really needs him to do. They don't need him to be a scrambler. They don't need him to be mobile. If he can maneuver a pocket and the offensive line takes a step forward, I think that will be huge. But I also think when that second portal opens up, I think Iowa's going to go all in on trying to get one more wide receiver at least. And the thing that's bothered me about Iowa, just compared to other schools, I think in general, they don't recruit enough scholarship wide receivers. I think if you recruit enough scholarship guys, I think you avoid the catastrophe that they had during spring ball last year, just as far as who's healthy and who's not. I mean, there's a reason why Iowa had to get multiple quarterbacks in the portal, because otherwise Joe Labas and Cade were taking every single snap, right?
And if Cade's not healthy, then you have, Joe Labas, and Joe Labas as your 3 options in spring ball. And
which I'm sure he would love, but
yeah, except his arm might fall off too. If he's he can't clone himself and be on 2 different spots on the field, or on the 2 different fields at one time in practice. So you could end up in practice like it's almost like a replay of the NFC Championship game with just not having enough healthy quarterbacks there. Like,
no,
you don't want that in spring practices. So,
and I'm curious how the fans rally around the team. Obviously, I think the sport's going to be there. I think it was Document had an excellent point yesterday where you said, ticket sales, went dead in the water after the 2014 season. Like, I'm estimating here. I expect there's going to be a decent percentage of fans that don't renew if Brian remains the offensive coordinator. And I will say this, and I think you agree with me. There's been a lot of rumblings about what's going to happen with Brian. Still, even post yesterday, anyone that believes he's 100% back is wrong, and anyone that believes he's out the door is wrong. And from who I have talked, dude, I'm sure you've had conversations too. There is no final decision made about where Brian's going to be next season. There's nothing that is set in stone at this time, but that's based on who I've talked to.
yeah, I think, if the right NFL opportunity comes about, yeah, Brian, that would be, I think, a very appealing thing for him. I think the two things that hold him back, I think the biggest thing is, and this is not going into, what I think of the lawsuit, but just the fact that the lawsuit is there,
It
I
does
think
play a factor.
is a
Yeah.
significant obstacle. Okay, do you want to deal with that? And I think the other thing too is, okay, you have the NFL connections, but the resume at Iowa has not looked great when you lead the 130th best offense. If you're going by yards per game, if you're going by points per
I
game,
don't think you put
okay, the
130th and follow it up with best.
Yeah, that doesn't look much better. So I think those are the two
Yeah.
things where, but yeah, I agree. It's not, what Kirk Ferentz anticipating is not necessarily, a perfect crystal ball of we could still see things change with the NFL hiring cycle.
Yeah.
I think those are the biggest obstacles that make Brian Ferentz staying certainly, very much within the picture. I would probably even give it a above 50% chance.
I still am. I'm very much 50-50. Like I really think it could go either way. And I know people are frustrated by that. Trust me, John and I are too, because we're the ones who are dealing with a lot of the fans are venting their frustrations. Like I get it. But the other thing that I would tell people to keep in mind is this. I listened to Cade McNamara on Big Ten Network yesterday. His first real interview, outside the podcast realm, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he said a big reason he came to Iowa was John Budmeyer. And remember, his brother, I believe, got recruited to Colorado State when Budmeyer was there. Cade's talked to him. He had a good relationship with him. And Deacon Hill, the Wisconsin quarterback transfer, came to Iowa for John Budmeyer. And this is where maybe my tinfoil hat theory comes into play, okay? Why are they coming to a school for an offensive analyst? That's a tough sell for me, in my opinion. I don't know what's going to happen with the coaching staff right now. Who knows? But if Brian moves on, John Budmeyer obviously is going to be a name to keep in mind. Whether he's a coordinator or not, I don't know, but at least he's going to coach the quarterbacks. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And for people that are frustrated about it, he's been really good on the recruiting trail of the schools he's been to regarding quarterbacks. So, again, maybe a tinfoil hat theory, but it makes sense to me.
I think the biggest obstacle, well, obviously, you first all have the assistant coach numbers where, okay, yep, you have the fans who want to see him get promoted. Okay, well, you only have so many on-field assistant coaches, and that's your issue. I think an analyst does end up doing more than what I think maybe the average fan realizes. And, I think sometimes they can't say so publicly because, the NCAA has rules around that. And,
yep,
there's some gray area in that. And, Kirk even kind of acknowledged a little bit of that gray area with there's the ongoing debate of what exactly an analyst can do. So we might not hear publicly about everything that John Budmeyer can do to help the quarterbacks, but that doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't a lot that he can do as offensive analyst. Of course, it's also important to keep in mind that Budmeyer's results with Spencer Petras and Alex Padilla weren't phenomenal last year, but that's also just 1 year. So we'll see.
I'd also be very curious what the workload was between Brian and and John as far as that goes, because Brian still is technically the quarterback's coach. But I want to circle back really quick to the press conference.
Mm-hmm.
People talk about, well, he's digging his heels and he's doubling down. John, didn't they double down last year when they promoted Brian to quarterback's coach as well as offensive coordinator and ran it back again? I mean, I don't know what it is at this point. It's not doubling down. It's like the A Christmas Story when they keep going up. I double dog dare you. Like, this is I triple dog dare you. Like, what are we doing here? And again, it's a difficult position. It's a unique circumstance for Iowa. And I've said this would not happen anywhere else in the country. It's a big power dynamic issue. I think Kirk has a great reputation. He gets results out of Iowa. He sends guys like he's a good, from my interactions, I think Kirk Ferentz is a good human being. He's done a lot for the state of Iowa. But again, when you bring family into the equation, it makes everything just so much more difficult. And Barda's in an uncomfortable situation. But the thing that really struck me wrong yesterday was Kirk just didn't seem to care what fans thought. And I think in most regards, that's probably wise. But after everything that's gone on over the past 2 years, as far as the offense goes, that's a tough one for me personally. He's asked about ticket sales, like Kirk almost brushed it off. Like, there was a lot of opportunities, and not to pat our media colleagues on the back, but
Mm-hmm.
I thought we gave Kirk a lot of opportunities to really sort of dig in and be like, okay, here's why, this is my thinking, yada, yada, yada. I mean, I asked him about the numbers. I asked him about, what's going to change or what gives him the confidence. And he ended the answer by talking about what Deontay Craig and Jay Higgins playing dodgeball.
I forgot
like
about
Kirk's
that moment
playing
there.
dodgeball at that point. I wish I could remember the exact wording of the question I had, but I remember I tuned out halfway through that answer because I'm just like, I don't know what more is to say. Oh, here's why I asked. Okay, I remember now. I can't remember who asked Brian this at the bowl game, but they said, "Hey, give yourself a self-evaluation.
Mm-hmm.
How would you?" I think maybe it was Chad. I like giving
Yeah, I
credit to
think it
people
was
asking
Chad,
questions.
but I could be wrong.
I think it was Chad. Chad asked him it, and I re-brought up to Kirk, and Brian said, "I did the best with the pieces I had." And Kirk essentially agreed with one sentence and then went down that path. And I'm just like, and the other thing is, if you did the best of the pieces that you had, why has no other program in Big Ten history been as bad as Iowa's offense was last year? Like, what circumstances were different for your team? And the other thing is, if the defense and special teams hadn't been as good this year, and if Iowa goes 4-8, do they fire Brian? Was Brian's job saved because of the defense and special teams and ultimately putting a W in the win column? I didn't think about that till right now, but certainly
I think
something to
it's an
think about.
interesting hypothetical. Like,
Yeah.
I think no matter what, he's still Kirk Ferentz's oldest son.
Yep.
So, I think that's very much regardless of result, and Kirk Ferentz still has a lot of job security because of, how much the buyout is. So, any math majors tuning in probably figure out the exact number at this point. So
I will say really quick though, I feel like I've kind of destroyed Brian, and I don't mean to do that. Like I think Gary Barta was spot on about one thing yesterday. Anyone who acts like Brian's not qualified or is not a good football mind, I don't know. I don't think they know football. Like, Brian, from all accounts and interactions I've had with him, I've heard behind the scenes, I've watched his seminars on YouTube. He knows football. The dude is a football savant, but that doesn't always translate to being able to coordinate an offense.
Yeah.
I just want to say it.
Like, you can be a very good tight ends coach for the New England Patriots, and you have to be a good football mind to be able to have success at that level. Now, the skill set of, an NFL position coach versus a Big Ten offensive coordinator isn't always the same there. And, Brian will have another chance to adjust and try to rework things, but, you don't give him too much benefit of the doubt based on these past years of adjustments or lack thereof. And, Kirk Ferentz said that, I think his exact word was like fairly fair or something like that, to say that not going to a spread offense, with him. So you're just not going to see those changes that you see other programs make. That, Wisconsin, I'm going to be curious to see what their offense looks like.
Wild. Like, that's going to be so weird to watch what they do. And especially Nebraska's implementing the H-back now. And like Nebraska is almost doing what Iowa wants to do offensively now, which is a very interesting turn of events too.
So that alone will just be an interesting thing to follow as we see. It's to be a case study of, the Kirk Ferentz consistency, staying consistent 24 years. Okay, there are going to be some rough spots, but you're going to bounce back, versus Wisconsin kind of adjusting with the times, I guess you'd say. And yeah, it'll be an interesting 2023 to watch nonetheless.
It will. And like you said, it's going to be intriguing to see what they change. I don't think they need to change a lot schematically. I think they need to change the route trees more than anything else. Like, you need to put yourself in a position to give wide receivers a chance to succeed. And I really just don't feel like Iowa's done a good job of that. And ultimately, that's how you're going to be able to land more wide receivers. Like right now, I do not envy Kelton Copeland. I don't envy Tyler Barnes trying to sell wide receivers in Iowa's offense, because if I'm the receiver, what ground is there to stand on? Yeah. There's guys getting more receiving receptions in a game than your top receiver does all season. Like it's going to be a wild circumstance. But again, I do think that the pressure has to be on Iowa. I think they need to win. In my opinion, they should win minimum 9. I think 10 games next year. Go back to Indianapolis. And I'll tell you this, there's nothing more that Cade McNamara wants than to go play Michigan in the Big Ten title. I think he's been very open in that podcast that he was on. I think it was called The Room.
I think podcast. It was. And I think one of the people on was his private quarterbacks coach.
I believe you're right. Yeah. And I'm like, if you listen to the interview, he wants him. Yeah. He wants him. So it'll be fun to follow for sure.
And I think the other thing too is the use of personnel to their strengths. I think about it, and like Arlen Bruce is a tremendously talented wide receiver. And of course, it didn't help that there were a lot of injuries around him. So at various points, at early points in the season, of course, then when you got Deontay Vines back, when you had Brody Brecht, you had later people that were healthy. So it wasn't like it's just him all year. But I think when you have a player like Arlen Bruce, there is a way to use him to be effective. And I don't know how much we saw that all the time this year. And I think
I'm with you on that. I think Arlen's very talented.
Oh, yeah. And I think back to like the same screenplay that I think is a screenplay that there was a throw to Sam Laporta in the Illinois game. And I'm kind of half picturing it in my head. And like, it would have worked great if the defense wasn't going to be keyed up on Sam Laporta, because he was option number 1, 2, and 3 at points, it felt like, this year. So I think in terms of play call setup, you have to be able to put your best players in a position to succeed. And
here's the other thing. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. That was basically like, you just have to put them in a position to make plays and do what they can do best.
I think this is the real year where we see what George Barnett's made of. I think he was an unfair scapegoat last season, because the people that were in were one, and Kirk said yesterday, and he's right, some of them weren't ready. Okay, that's the reality of it. They weren't guys Barnett recruited, and Barnett's done a killer job on the recruiting trail, in my opinion. Yeah. I mean, he's a very personal guy. I like him a lot. I think he's a really good. I think he's a good person. I think he's a proven offensive line coach. But now that they got some veteran pieces, I want to see Logan Jones take the big next step. I want to see Mason Richmond, Connor Colby still strike me as 2 potential all Big Ten caliber guys. I think they've played a lot of football. They can take a step forward. And then you have Rusty, who's the second team All-MAC, and you have Dijon Parker, who I'm he's on day 3 radar right now for the NFL. Like the NFL is aware of him. 6'6", 305. If the offensive line doesn't improve, then I think we're talking more about Barnett. But I thought Barnett was a scapegoat to some extent last year. He was doing what he. If you talk about a guy doing what he could with what he had, it's George Barnett.
Oh yeah, like that's a difficult position, and I think the one kind of thing that if you look back at the offensive line, you would have liked to see some of the mistakes that happened later in the year not happen, like a false start on the center. But overall, when you look at it, he had a tough hand to work with. And you look at it, a lot of guys, well, just look at what happened to their, I think, at 2018 and 2019 recruiting classes for offensive linemen. Like, if you pull up, if you go up on 24/7, look back on the database to those 2 years, and you look at those offensive linemen, look at how much of a role they had at Iowa. And you just don't have much. And I think you look at it, Connor Colby did not look as good this year as he did last year. But it also is a difference when you have Tyler Linderbaum next to you. Like,
agreed.
I would be blown away playing guard in college football, but I'd probably look slightly less blown away trying to play guard in college football if I had Tyler Linderbaum next to me. So
he cover up a lot. Yeah.
That's another thing too, is just like George Barnett is used in press conferences, the analogy of like, you're a conventional 11 guy. If you're an offensive line coach, you're not a microwave guy. And like, okay, you're seeing the conventional oven, like the timer on the stove is going down now to closer to where you should expect to see some of these guys really develop. And there is some long-term downside to, okay, you're throwing these guys into mix rather than kind of on a development course for being ready in a couple of years. There are still some challenges, but
yeah,
like he's going to have a more experienced group to work with versus last year's group. You had a lot of guys who, could be really talented, but we're just thrown in really early. And like, I'm really curious to see like a Jennings Dunker or a Bo Stevens, those two guys. They're
going to have to compete now too, for sure,
yeah.
especially with Rusty in the mix. Absolutely. And Connor moving back to full-time guard as well. Because remember, he started at tackle, and then there's like I think it was after the Ohio State game.
Yeah, which did not go well.
Putting him back at, well, that's, yeah, it's, I'm still amazed. I don't want to like reminisce too much on it. I'm amazed how good that defense gave up 50 plus points, and the defense was absolutely phenomenal that game.
Yes. The best defensive effort you will ever see for a team that gave up, was it 55? Something like that.
54. Well, yeah, I mean, I think about like the first four of their first like 7 possessions were inside like Iowa's 35, and they held them to 4 field goals.
Yeah.
That's bonkers to me, especially when you have Marvin Harrison Jr., who honestly, I think he could win the Heisman next year.
He's really
that dude is. I love 24/7. I think we do a great job with our rings. He should have been a 5-star. He was a high 4. He should have been a 5-star. Like just by, hey, say it, name alone, he should have been a 5-star.
Like,
but by the way, about Arlen Bruce, like we rated Arlen Bruce on our transfer portal rankings. We re-ranked the players based on what they did in college. He was still a 4-star transfer prospect by us. So like, again, people who think, oh, Arlen's not that big of a loss, didn't exactly have a lot of opportunity to succeed in Iowa's system last year.
Yeah, exactly. So we'll see what comes ahead. There's still a long time between now and September. So, we'll have spring practices. That's kind of the big next development period for football. Got the May transfer portal window, as we've talked about, that, is an important time for Iowa. I think especially at linebacker, although defense has been less of an issue. So it'll be an interesting look ahead, that's for sure.
Iowa's also still in the mix for Virginia transfer linebacker Nick Jackson, who was 100+ tackles on the season last year. I mean, I know he's between Oklahoma, Iowa, I think maybe Auburn and a couple others, but he officially visited Iowa last weekend. You talk about a perfect candidate to take over for Jack Campbell. You really don't get much better than that. And I think obviously Iowa's linebackers. I remember none of the starting linebackers last year practiced in spring. So a
Mm-hmm.
lot of those guys have gotten those valuable reps. They need to see it translate. But there's a lot of talent in that room. I think Seth Wallace has done a phenomenal job. I think if Iowa would have found a way to get Seth Benson back for another year, that would have been a huge boost. But
Or if Justin Jacobs didn't enter the portal. I think you just
yeah,
need that. If you can get that one more guy, if Jackson is that guy, I think you're in good shape. But it would just be helpful if they
yeah.
don't have, you know, Jay Higgins is right now kind of the one guy that's
Thank
had
you. I was
really
going to say Jay
substantial
Higgins. Yes.
in-game
Yeah.
snaps. And if you had another guy who had that experience, that room could look really good. But you
I'd
just,
also say this though, that D line's going to be filthy next year, even without Lucas. Like Deontay Craig was criminally undervalued, I think,
oh yeah, he
by
should have
most
been
people
an all
because
Big
Van Ness.
Ten player.
I'm with you on that. He was outstanding in the bowl game at 3.5 tackles for loss. But Jamari Harris coming back. That's another guy who's been a dog on the secondary. You got Cooper DeJean, who, if Devin Witherspoon didn't exist, wins defensive back of the year in the Big Ten, in my opinion. And you have the 5-star safety Xavier Wampa finally getting a
Yeah.
full-time starting job. Like that
And Quinn
secondary is going
Schulte,
to be filthy next year.
has
You
done
got,
a quality job too at free safety. So you look at it, you'd like to see, and Sebastian Castro made a big jump, I
yeah,
think,
absolutely.
with the between end of the regular season and the bowl game.
He was
Now I think,
outstanding that first half in that bowl game, especially.
oh yeah, I think you'd like to see a little more depth at the defensive back area. I think if you can get some development of some of those young cornerbacks, that would be helpful. But you look at it defensively, they're pretty well set. You know, linebacker being that one kind of wild card there. Special teams, you've got Drew Stevens back, who
Yep.
Kurt Ferentz said they're trying to get on scholarship. Logistically, that can be a little difficult with all the moving pieces of the transfer portal and such. And you've got Tory Taylor back, who obviously has had a tremendous first 3 years at Iowa. So you look at it, there are reasons to be optimistic with this defense and the special teams. And, we've talked about the offensive talent. It's just a matter of can they get some of these things figured out and putting players in the best position to succeed.
I'm with you. I think the one thing I would have liked to see is more transparency about the evaluation of Brian,
Yeah.
what those expectations are from Gary. Because this is my tinfoil hat. This is nothing I'm hearing. This is my speculation. Gary, there's two things I believe are true. One, Gary is giving his full support to Brian Ferentz.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I still don't exactly think that he sounded enthusiastic about Brian coming back, because an AD having a direct conversation with an offense coordinator about what expectations are going to be, like, from my standpoint, it told me, from Gary's perspective, it's put up or shut up for the offense. He basically said it without saying it. And again, I'm trying to read between the lines, nothing I'm hearing. So I don't want people getting that misconstrued. And I want your take on it really quick. If Iowa's offense is bad again next year, like, Gary's going to be like, I don't care what happens. Like, he's gone. That's the way I heard it when he said, we're having conversations about what the expectations are. It isn't good enough. Yada, yada.
I'm not quite comfortable going that much on a limb about that. I think, like, Gary clearly wants to see better. And I think he was
Absolutely.
trying to convey that, okay, having the 130th best offense is not okay. Now, to what extent, is he willing to go with that? We'll see in a year. So, if the offense doesn't improve, well, then we'll find out. But I think for reasons we've discussed earlier, it's a tough position that he's in when Kirk isn't going to want to pull that trigger. Yep. So,
and again, I don't want to say, like, I'm just purely speculating based on the wordage that was used. And I think he could have earned a lot more brownie points had he been very transparent about what the goals are. But again, I also think to be fair, I think saying you need to hit this certain amount of points, like, I that's a tough one for me to cross from an athletic director perspective.
Because I asked what specifically the expectations were, and he said that he doesn't want to publicly disclose that. And I would have, very much as a journalist appreciated the transparency. I also see from his perspective where if he says, okay, they need to be above 24 points per game offensively, which isn't really that high of a bar for most teams. But if they say, okay, you need to be above 24 points per game offensively, and then let's say through the first 3 games they're at 18, that could be a distraction that they might not want to have. So I see where they're coming on that.
Yeah. No, I do too. I just wish we had more answers to what was actually going to happen. Because again, nothing surprised me yesterday, but it does not calm the masses.
Oh no, most certainly not. And yeah, the kind of the answer that I don't think anyone likes to hear is we'll see. But
at least he didn't say that's football.
Yes. No, that's footballs yesterday. So
thankful.
Well, any podcast where a Christmas story gets mentioned is a great podcast. So thank you for that. Best Christmas movie ever. Thanks for joining me on this week's edition of Hawk Off the Press.
Thanks for having me, John. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. And thanks to our listeners for tuning into another episode. Until next week, we will talk Hawks later.